Welcome to the Vision by Protiviti interview. I'm Joe Cornick, Editor-in-Chief of Vision by Protiviti, where we look into the future to examine the implications of big topics that will impact businesses worldwide over the next decade and beyond. We've got an outstanding guest today as we welcome Dr. Ian Oppermann, the New South Wales Government's Chief Data Scientist, working within the Department of Customer Service. Dr. Oppermann is also an industry professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, and served as CEO of the New South Wales Data Analytics Centre from 2015 to 2019. He is considered a thought leader on the digital economy, big data, and an expert on the future impact of technology on society. Dr. Oppermann will be interviewed by my colleague, Ghislaine Entwisle, a managing director at Protiviti Australia and co-leader of the IT advisory practice. I'm looking forward to an enlightening discussion, so I'll turn it over to Ghislaine to begin.
Thanks, Joe. Great to be here, and it's so lovely to be joined today by Dr. Ian Oppermann. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks, Ghislaine. Great to be here.
Ian, the global pandemic has had such a material impact on the way we work. What do you think are the biggest takeaways from the pandemic, and what will be its legacy in terms of how it impacted how, where, and when we work?
Thanks, Ghislaine. That is the question of the hour. COVID has really changed or accelerated so many things that we were doing, at least from a tech perspective. I mean, it's had an incredible impact on the entire globe. It's taught us about the value of inequality. It's taught us about the value of thinking and acting globally. But from a tech perspective, what it did was accelerate telework, telehealth, teleeducation. The conversation we're having right now is one that we might have had under normal circumstances, but it's something which has just become normal. And each and every one of us now has a little home studio, and sometimes there are screaming kids in the background, sometimes there are dogs and cats up on the screen, but this is normal. And that in a work environment is one thing, but the implications for things like telehealth and teleeducation, I think, are actually much more profound. Australia has a real challenge with the tyranny of distance. We know that health outcomes in regional and remote Australia are very different to urban environments. And I'm hoping that the greater acceptance of telehealth in particular will have a very substantial impact on a whole range of life outcomes. And teleeducation, I hope, will also have some substantial impacts on educational outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you mentioned technology as being cornerstone to this. It has been so crucial to working through this pandemic, and it will perhaps be even more important in the future. In your view, how will technology continue to influence the future of work, both the near and the far term? And do you have any sort of local examples that you can provide on this?
So that's another great question. Pre-COVID, we spent a little bit of time thinking about what the future would look like. And the big issues were being able to handle data in an appropriate way, getting our governance right, being able to increasingly be comfortable with increasing use of increasing amounts of data. Fast forward with COVID, what we've seen, of course, is that all of those long-term trends still remain, but the need to really get serious about cybersecurity, where everybody suddenly is a node in a network, as opposed to people working in a normal office environment where normal sorts of security and governance can be applied. Everybody really is their own little home office now. And so being serious about cybersecurity, being serious about making sure that we are connected in an appropriate way, I think are some of the. It's not so subtle, but it's a reasonably important shift to the way we think about decentralized engagement. And I think the longer term consequences are that increasingly we are not just connecting with people, we're connecting with devices, and devices are connecting with devices. So those futuristic ideas of the Internet of Things suddenly become much, much more significant, much, much more important. So that rather than you and I talking to each other via a video system, many distributed devices are talking to each other in environments which, again, are not as well controlled as if it was a centralized office environment or a centralized network. So that broad distribution of many devices operating in a relatively insecure way, where any particular device could be compromised either deliberately or compromised due to some sort of failure, is the thinking we need to bring to future very complex systems where we are forced to rely on inherently unreliable systems, potentially creating vulnerabilities, but requiring us to think differently about how we deal with very complex, very distributed systems.
Oh, absolutely. And I think your point around it being so much more of a complicated technology landscape than we've had before does mean that organizations and people have to be a lot more switched on around all of those potential vulnerabilities and risks that they previously haven't experienced, or certainly not as experienced in as intensely as they have in the examples that you provide. Specifically around the technologies, what specific technology do you think will have the greatest impact on the future work over the course of the next decade?
So there are some really big tech looming on the horizon. Quantum, I think, is one of the really most important ones. And as we increasingly move towards viable quantum computing, there are a couple of fundamental issues we have to address. I mean, security as we know it suddenly gets a very great challenge simply because we're relying on hard puzzles being solved by linear computing devices. A quantum computer can do things very, very differently. We also, of course, are thinking about technologies, again, where everything is connected to everything else. I spent some of my time working with the world of 6G, trying to bring 6G to life. And the idea of not billions of devices, but hundreds of billions of devices being connected, again, means you need to think very, very differently about not just issues of complexity and cybersecurity, but also issues around energy consumption. At the moment, it's estimated that something like 2% of the world's energy is being consumed by data centers. If you replace data centers with an incredibly distributed data storage, data connection type of devices, plus everything being able to communicate with everything else, and data analytics and AI being thrown in on top of all of that, the percentage of the global energy budget we consume with data analytics, AI, and moving data suddenly has the potential to really skyrocket. So thinking about energy consumption in data analytics is a very, very important aspect of how we think about the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And as data just there's more and more of it every single day, it's absolutely going to continue to be a very big thing that we need to worry about. And you're right. I mean, the energy impact is something that we should be more aware of the impact and how we can manage that and mitigate some of that as well. Thinking about it from future work, from an employee engagement and customer experience perspective, how do you think that might change in the future?
So that's really interesting. Our idea of that total customer experience in general is something which is based on the historical model of slowly but surely building up an engagement between people. Again, if this is the new normal, if what we're doing right now is the new normal, that sort of 2D projection of an engagement is something which we're getting better at. But at the very best, you could say it's a 2.5D engagement as opposed to a real human interaction. So being able to either accept this as a reasonable way of engaging, just as we accepted telephone as a 1D engagement, and it was okay, it was normal, and that's what we expected. But if we are really trying to replicate an in-person engagement between people and customers, between co-workers, between a doctor and a patient, between a teacher and a student, there's a lot more that we need to bring to bear, or we need to change our expectations. And I currently think we've all accepted that COVID means we need to do this, so we will engage this way. But I think that future, the challenge has always been during COVID, we can't build teams, we can't form, we can't norm, we can't storm. We've got along as best we can. If that was really the long-term future, then it has all sorts of great implications for where teams can form, but it has really got implications for the human interaction. There's another interesting part to that. I spend a lot of my time working with international standards, and that's by definition global. We're trying to use 3 different time zones to ensure that we are as inclusive as possible. But the reality is there's a lot more European-centric or North American-centric time zones than those which are favorable for people in Asia-Pacific. And if we are to work like this in future, we really need to think more about diversity and inclusion. And that means geographic inclusion and time zone inclusion. And I would never have thought we'd be talking about time zone inclusion as a real issue. But the midnight to 3 a.m. calls and only once, falling asleep during a meeting, which is something which would be outrageous 2 years ago, is something increasingly you start to hear people get quieter and quieter as the meeting progresses. And you think at some point, I've probably lost my colleague. And again, that's something which we hadn't really considered as a real issue. We are prepared to make allowances for during COVID, but we have to get that right if we're going to operate in a genuine distributed tele world.
Yeah, and absolutely right. I mean, there's a difference between allowing it for a short-term period during the pandemic, but then going back to it afterwards. You're right. This is something that we're looking to build into the way in which we operate in the future, or the future of work. We do really need to think about what that looks like and what that really means for our, customers, our employees as well. So it's some really interesting insights there. But what will organizations need to be aware of in shaping their workforce of the future? Interested in your perspective on what role maybe artificial intelligence would play, and also a bit about how that might impact the diversity of the workforce in 2030.
I was actually thinking about that when giving the last answer, because I think AI will play an increasingly important role. And AI, the good thing is, I think we're still a long way from that point of singularity where AI is much, much smarter than human beings. But AI is increasingly good at doing mundane, repeatable tasks, but moving up the value creation stack. So it's not just doing something again and again and again. Things like e-discovery have shown that there are some aspects which we used to think were relevant to people that can be done by devices. But one of the really important dimensions of this problem, or this opportunity, are that as AI increasingly becomes more generalized, and again, I think there's a long way from that point of singularity, it's the creativity of people, it's the diversity of thought, it's the inclusiveness of people with different perspectives that will really be competitive differentiators. And in my arguments with the standards, in my robust discussions with the standards community about the need to really have this rotating time zones and allow everybody to be included, is that if we don't have diversity, then we run the risk of just having a relatively small group of people think through a particular approach to a challenging problem. And it will be diversity, not just a nice to have, but diversity will start to become a genuine competitive advantage when things which are not that creative or are increasingly more repetitive start to be able to be done through AI. So diversity, I think, will be one of the really interesting opportunities for all people in the workplace as increasingly mundane tasks get automated away. Diversity will be a competitive differentiator. And I really hope companies start to see that and really start to compete for diversity in the workforce.
I think that would be an absolutely wonderful outcome. And I think to your points earlier around the time zone inclusion and other components that do mean some parts of the world are less well represented, the quality of any of our solutions that we developed is tailored to a small minority. And that's not what we want. We get the power of innovation through really leveraging the diversity of what the globe has to offer. So I love that insight, Ian. If we look now from the perspective of education, training, leadership development, talent management, career pathways, how will that, do you think, change in the future?
So there's a lot to what you've just said. So one of the things that we saw pre-COVID was the advent of massive online training, so the MOOCs. And what it meant was that someone in Sydney could reach out to many tens of millions of people in China and North America. I have a colleague from the University of Technology who's done exactly that, really, really popular online courses on AI. And again, that sort of takes us a step forward in terms of our ability to be able to expand and scale the influence of an individual. But that's, again, not all of it. That point about developing an integrated, diverse and inclusive perspective on a whole range of different problems that people tackle will remain the challenge. Telecommunications and scaling and recording and the use of ICT allows us to project one to many. It still doesn't really address the many to many or the many to one. That challenge still remains. So there are some uniquely human aspects to all sorts of team or workforce or educational developments where people are still the unique element in the network. We don't scale very well, in particular when we're many to one. And yet it's that genuine human interaction with teams, that forming and norming, which really allows for the storming, which we haven't quite got right. So I think there are still some really important scaling issues we need to think about. And I think there are some really important elements of going beyond 3D. If phone is 1D, if what we're doing now is kind of sort of 2D, if perhaps other sorts of integrated media give us 3D, that's still not quite it. And as a species, we have always done well when different people come together and exchange ideas in a meaningful way and build trust and build relationships and then work together. A casual interaction may allow you to exchange an idea, but to really move forward as a high performing team, you really do need to have those human interactions where you long-term trust the people you're working with, long-term are willing to bring your full self into that engagement. And if I'd never met you before, Ghislaine, I'd be really enjoying this conversation, but I know who you are, I trust you, and I'd be very happy to collaborate in this form for some time. But if we'd never had that initial building stage, it would be difficult.
Yes, and as you say, then that then makes your education or training experience far less rich, and so you're not getting those innovation, the creation, that the great outcome of really rich interactions. And so, as you say, there's a way to go to lift that, to enable us to have those rich experiences. If we sort of then look at, what type of tools and techniques will organizations need to be proficient in to grow at the pace we expect change to move?
There are some fundamentals, the sort of things that we're using right now, the ability to have secure, reliable, appropriate quality communications. It's very, very important. The ability to have distributed security in systems like this is very, very important. But then beyond that, the knowledge management and exchange, I think, are really going to be very important. And again, at the risk of harping on about some of the issues I've already raised, the ability to find ways to collaborate. There've been a few really interesting tools that we've tried online whiteboarding. It's not quite the same as holding a pen and actually standing there and sparking up each other. There are some tools around sidebar conversations, and we've got breakout rooms and such things. And again, I don't think they're a good step, but they're not quite all the way there. But if we project forward to say 2050 and the sort of challenges we're looking at there, I hope we'll have data and security, well, maybe not security, but at least we'll have data and governance issues sorted out. Let's fingers crossed on that one. But the issues we'll be looking at in the world of 2050 will be very, very different issues. Changing climate, aging, urbanizing population, and a very, very different world in terms of where we live and the intensity with which we're living in that world. The issues then are going to be issues about inequality and issues around how we ensure that things like a global pandemic, which will keep coming back to bite us in waves because the world has different access to resources, different access to medicines, different access to education, and different perspectives, are the sorts of challenges we really need to think hard about how we globalize these local pockets of connectivity, pockets of creativity, and pockets of interaction. So I think what we all need to get better at is thinking about a global community, thinking about the inequalities which will inevitably arise because we all live somewhere, we all interact with the real world in some way, and thinking about what we could do with the digital world, which will allow us to increasingly address some of those real physical geographic inequalities.
And I think that's a great challenge to everyone listening today. How can we actually influence that in a positive way so there is less inequality in the world and there's more opportunity to connect equally. So I think that's great. And we're touching a little bit there around sort of global perspectives. I was keen to get your thoughts around how can government and industry bodies actually influence global standards and policies to perhaps either enable a faster pace of innovation or actually just to connect more.
One of the things that COVID has shown us is that this is a global problem. If we're not all equally vaccinated or have access to vaccines, if we're not all equally aware and understand the challenges, then we will find that inequality actually allows COVID to do its next trick and come back and impact the world. And then another pocket of inequality allows COVID to do its next trick, and so on. And so as a consequence, we have this dance with COVID, which will potentially go on much, much longer than if we all had equal access. So one of the things governments can do is, first of all, agree with each other that there are a minimum set of conditions. I was going to say standards, but I tend to reserve standards for things like ISO and IEC, but a minimum set of standards with a small s around the access to different resources, a minimum set of standards around an understanding that if we don't have the access to resources, we don't have access to the tech, that we will start to create a multi-speed global economy or multi-speed global community. We've talked about third world and we've talked about first world and sometimes second world. That sort of labeling of the different environments people are in is great if you're a 19th century economist or a 20th century economist. It's not going to work for the 22nd century. And if we think about the fact that differences drive the opportunity for really catastrophic outcomes, either through mass migration or through people looking for a better life and physically leaving the environment they're in because they don't have access to those resources, or the opportunity for viruses to essentially have an environment that they can propagate and reproduce and evolve. Those massive inequalities have the potential to constantly bite the first world and the second world. So governments acknowledging that in many respects, we don't have a choice but to think globally, and we should actually operate with a global mentality. I think that's important. So, things like COP26, great opportunity for the world to come together and say, climate change is real. There are some minimum things we need to do. I think that's really, really important. Local politics drives local thinking. Local politics drives local decision making. And as a consequence, we have to be able to some extent, acknowledge that whilst we might want to do things locally, we always have to have an eye on the global environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you say, thinking globally is going to be more and more important in the future. So we can't just have that as an afterthought and be selfish about the location we're in, which we exist or we're being represented politically. We need to be thinking globally. So I think that's certainly very interesting. So, Ian, when you look at the overall landscape of work, workers, workplaces a decade from now, what do you see and how different do you think that'll be? What are the most radical changes that you envision?
I think the potential for the gig economy and for piecework, the sort of thing that we used to see in the 18th century in Europe, I think there's a real potential for that to return. And in order for that to return and be beneficial, then again, we need some minimum conditions around what it means. It's not going to be okay anymore to just outsource dangerous, dirty, dull tasks to third world countries and say, off you go, do it. The sort of things that we've seen in the past of recycling, where people are sitting in appalling conditions, pulling apart devices with potentially toxic materials, but certainly in a very dangerous environment compared to what we would expect in the Western world. It can't be okay for us anymore to send fast fashion development requirements in batches to again, developing countries and say, we will benefit based on that short-term piecework, which ultimately leads to a pretty dramatic misuse or wastage of resources. Fast fashion, I think, has been an absolute disaster for the environment. So the future of work, I think piecework will be with us, but we need to think differently about how it happens. We also need to think much more in terms of the circular economy. There was something just recently announced about there now being a race in Australia to develop a recycling environment for solar panels. They have an approximate life of 20 years. We're pushing really hard to develop solar panels as a response to climate change, and also it's generally good for energy systems to have distributed sources coming in. So all good things, except 20 years on, you've got a massive waste problem. So the ability to think constantly about the entire life cycle of materials, including the human involvement in those materials, including what happens to materials after they're manufactured and then headed towards what would otherwise be waste, and acknowledging that there are some elements that we have no choice about. We're running out of some of the exotics. We're running out of some general materials, which are lithium is a great example at the moment. It's becoming such an incredibly contested resource that the price of lithium has gone up fivefold in a relatively short period of time. So rare materials are going to be things we need to think about. And the intersection between waste and water and energy are things that we also need to think about in a much more profound sense. We have a finite set of resources on the planet. No more land, no more water, no more natural resources. We have what we have. Water is something which it always has been a problem for the entire lifespan of humankind. And we haven't necessarily treated it as one of the most valuable commodities we've got, because it's in relative abundance in relative areas. But the one thing we do have in abundance is energy, not necessarily from digging up coal, digging up fossil fuels, but the fact we get hit every single day by enough energy to power the entire planet from solar means that we've got a window of opportunity to think about how we use the resources we've got, how we harvest the waste we've got, and take advantage of natural sources of energy, and to think about all of that in a more sustainable way in a circular economy sense. Again, not just materials, not just what we do with waste, not just what happens when something leaves the circular economy by becoming toxic or radioactive, but thinking about all of that and the intersection of people and their role in those different stages. I hope some of the things that are happening in the world at the moment will help us think more like that, but that more holistic perspective of resources and people and circular, I really hope is the future of work, the future of the economy, of all economies, and also the future of that much more inclusive and more equitable interaction with different parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great vision to paste. I think if all organizations, as they're shaping products or designing services, that they're thinking in that globally sustainable, what's my impact on the world, from a people, process, technology perspective, then we're all going to make much better decisions, and also have a better future for the next generation. So I think that's really a great inspirational thoughts there, Ian. Thank you for that. And I guess ultimately one final question. Will how we work be better in 2030 and beyond?
We always look to the future and say there's a beautiful potential future waiting for us. But ultimately, we as people will still go to work. We'll still get bored. We will still think that our boss is a numbskull from time to time, and particularly if our boss is an intelligent device. And we'll still dislike our colleagues on and off. So some aspects about the future of work will be reflective of us as humans. But I genuinely hope we have more flexibility. I genuinely hope that some of what we've learnt during COVID, that it isn't a 9-to-5 presenteeism issue, and that you can be creative after 5, even if you haven't worked in the morning. That I hope some of that flexibility is part of the way we think in the future. All of the people I know, professional people I know who've retired, are more busy after they have retired than before. And you say, I don't think you actually understood the point of retirement. The response is almost inevitably that now I get more choice. I get to choose when I do things and how much effort I put into them, and I get to dial things up and dial things down. If we can bring that into the normal work life, the normal career period, not only will it mean that retirement can get pushed out a little bit, or our transition to retirement might change, which again, if we've got an aging population and a growing population, that those retirement thresholds are things that we've been seriously looking at over the last decade in Australia, and increasing the age of retirement, the age you can access superannuation or even the pension. So I think it will make that transition to retirement easier. I think it'll make it easier for people to stay in the workforce. And I think it will actually make working more enjoyable. But I guarantee you, people will still like and dislike their colleagues during the course of their career, and they'll think their bosses are a numbskull during the course of their career.
That's true. They'll still, after all, we are human, so there'll be some of those things that don't change. But I think, look, it's been a wonderful to spend the time with you. Thank you for your time. We've thoroughly enjoyed it. I think everyone will take something away from this, whether it's a little bit more sense of responsibility about the impact of our decisions and organizations' decisions, or whether it's just a feeling of, well, take the challenge. How are we going to influence that to be a better 2030 or 2050 than without the roles that we play? So thank you so much for joining us today, Ian. Been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Ghislaine. Great to be here.
Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Ghislaine, for those great questions. Thank you, Dr. Oppermann, for those insightful answers. And thank you for watching the Vision by Protiviti interview. I'm Joe Cornick, and we'll see you next time.